Josh Stevens.
MZ, Michael Zwerling.
Has anybody had the flu or COVID around here that you know of?
To the best of my knowledge, no one has had the COVID cooties.
Just to be safe, Josh Stevens, I'm going to slather myself with PureWorks and these headphones. Do the guests want to do that too? I'm asking you too late, huh?
I already did, Michael.
Okay. Oh, you already did?
I did.
With PureWorks?
Yeah, with that.
Oh, that's fantastic. But what about Randall?
Well, I may have missed it.
Never too late, you know. It wouldn't hurt. It could only help. It can't hoit, right? Okay. Now, Josh Stevens, I need to ask you a personal question, as I always do, as I always try to.
You sure do.
What is your IQ?
I have no idea about that because I never knew of an official test, but I'd say it's definitely up there considering my level of intuition.
Well, give a guess.
I'll say 160 if that's a high number.
I don't know too much. You know, I am 68 and almost 69 years of age, and you would think in all these years that I would have submitted to an IQ test. But I haven't because I'm frankly afraid. I'm afraid it'll come back too low. And then I'll be ashamed.
But you run the station, and the station only caters to everyone but stupid people. So I think the contrary. I think your IQ test would actually be up there, MZ.
You know, it's probably not wise for me to continue this line of conversation because I'll probably regret it. However, Josh Stevens, I've been thinking about this for a while, and something we've never done here at your favorite radio station is do a Saturday special, nor any program that I know of, on the intelligence quotient. And where is there an IQ? How do people know their IQ? Do they just guess it?
They throw a dart at a board with a bunch of numbers.
Right.
And whatever number that dart lands on, that's your IQ.
Oh.
But they have to have a science throw the darts. You can't throw them yourself in case you're like really good at darts.
Oh, geez. Okay. Well, do you like the idea about a whole Saturday special devoted to IQ?
We love to hear it, MZ.
Really? Who would I get as guests?
I have no idea, but I feel you're smart enough.
If you're anywhere near 160, I think you should have not only an idea, but many.
Well, I've never thought of you or anyone having a show on that, so this is already mind-blowing of its own.
Okay.
See, your IQ test would be in the bag. You already know it.
Well, okay, the IQ show. Okay, well, while we're thinking more about it and putting it out to the audience, okay, maybe the audience will have an idea about who we should have as a guest on the Saturday IQ special show, okay? But in the meantime...
Good morning.
Sorry.
Good morning. May we bring you cheer.
We've got time, we've got tunes, we've got time to...
Turn it up a little.
Get up and go, it's today, you know, on KSCO Radio.
The reason
It's way too quiet.
there's no music. Josh, talk on the microphone.
Yeah, there should be music right there. I heard it going. And I don't know why it's not happening.
You know what? This is such a disaster, as the president would say. You know, Donald Trump says two words more than I know what's happened. Some some dirty bee pushed a button that shouldn't have been pushed here on the console. That's why I couldn't hear myself talk. That's why I had to turn your volume up so loudly so that I could hear you, so that when I put the music on, it blew all of our eardrums out. I think we're going to have to cancel the show now because none of us can hear.
Yep, and if you can't hear...
Neither the guests nor the host.
We have guests?
Can't you see?
No, I think that sound was so loud it blinded me and made me deaf.
All right. We need to do it again because I've never opened the show where I didn't speak in the donut. So let's do it again.
Good morning.
Now it sounds good.
A brighter day is here. Good morning. May we bring you cheer.
We've got time, we've got tunes, we've got time, tunes, and temperature.
Get up and go, it's today you know on KSCO Radio.
Okay, welcome Monterey Bay, Silicon Valley, and everybody else who can hear your favorite radio station, KSCO, emanating from Santa Cruz, the character capital of the world. There are more characters per square inch here than anywhere else on the planet. And do we have a shoe for you today? We're going to have a lot of fun talking about dead people and lots of them. So stay tuned.
Good morning. Now stay right here on KSCO Radio.
That is the special fanfare music bed, which signifies that we have not one today, but two special guests in the KSCO studio to talk about impotent dead people. Yes, Traci Bliss, who is an emeritus professor of education from Idaho State University and who clearly bucks the crowd, because I was telling her that people are leaving in droves. You know, they're leaving Santa Cruz and California for Idaho. I mean, I can't tell you how many people are fleeing California for Idaho. And she said, well, I came back from Idaho to Santa Cruz. So, Traci, welcome to KSCO. Oh, come to the mic. Pull the microphone about 10 feet closer to your mouth. It should be an inch away from your lips.
Thank you. It's a thrill to be here.
Okay. Good. And your mother and my mother were chums at the Children's Home Society, you told me.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Many, many years ago.
Yes. My mother was just a few years younger than Kay, and Kay was quite an inspiration to her. So, yes, we have
Wow.
that nice connection.
What a coincidence. She was quite an inspiration to me, too. Okay, and now we have, in addition to Traci Bliss, who is an author of the book that we're going to be talking about on today's Saturday special, The Evergreen Cemetery of Santa Cruz. Now, it's not just any old cemetery. It's the Evergreen Cemetery. You will not find a cemetery anywhere in the country, or probably in the world, quite like this. And as we get into the meat of the program, you'll find out why. But our other guest is none other than the Randall Brown, who is a local historian, and we are so happy to welcome you. Randall, would you mind pulling that microphone even closer to you so that you can speak? No, you don't. Yeah, that's good. Perfect.
Okay, yeah, let me figure out how that works. Okay.
Fantastic.
There we go.
So you've been an historical person.
Yeah, I write. I'm mostly specialized on San Lorenzo Valley issues. I actually wrote a book on the SLV Water District.
Oh.
back in the day. It's been
Oh,
a while.
wow.
You know, actually, the ending is different now. We may need to change some things, but so I've been sort of plugging
That's sort
away.
of that's one of the more controversial water districts around, huh?
Yeah, I mean, some of it was a little more fuss than necessary, but it's a very challenging line of work, and of course, right now with the fire, they got some issues that they're going to have to work through.
Wow.
But yeah, very important area to study, and I enjoy public history, which this is sort of.
And it's
form of.
about time that the KSCO Saturday Special did a program on history, area history, because every time we do that, we get patted on the back. And whenever we do other things, people throw darts at us, you know, and so it's nice to. I'm expecting a lot of pats on the back as a result of today's program, right? So, anyhow, the Evergreen Cemetery. Now that's on Evergreen Street, right?
Right next to Harvey West Park.
Right. Yes, and it's a upslope. I guess you call it an upslope because it's up from the street. It's an upslope. And when I was a youngster, many years ago, I used to, play at the Evergreen Cemetery, which wasn't very well maintained back in those days. Now, I guess it's been recognized as a treasure, as a community treasure that we need to honor and care for. And
That's absolutely right. And I bet back in the day when you were playing there, it was kind of a beacon for bad behavior. Did you think that?
that is exactly right, and so was I. Yeah. So yeah, some of the things that we did, but you know, I remember that so many of the headstones were damaged back then, and it wasn't a. It was a place where even I thought, gee, there should be more respect exhibited toward. I didn't know all the important people who were buried there, you know, that you learn about in your book. But let's talk about when and why you came up with the idea to write the book Evergreen Cemetery of Santa Cruz, which is full of pictures and texts and famous people's names.
characters.
Huh?
And characters.
Yeah.
So I just wanted to write an article for a journal explaining my family's decision in 1858 to give a piece of their land. It was a cattle ranch in the 1850s. The Imus family, Don Imus, related. He's my.
I was going to say it can't be, but it is.
He was like my fifth cousin. So the Imus family, they were cattle ranchers, and they decided to give a section of their land where they had buried two of their own. And so I just wanted to write that article to set the record straight.
Wow. I
But
had no idea.
I got more and more into it. I realized, wait a second, there were only like 700 or 800 people in Santa Cruz at that time. And this wasn't simply about my family giving their land. It was this community all-out effort because they desperately needed a cemetery that was open to all. You couldn't. Where did you get buried if you weren't Catholic? Where could you get buried? So it was.
I didn't know that either.
Right.
So they had Holy Cross Cemetery back before then, or
They did, and
but
that,
nothing else.
Nothing else. They had a small Methodist cemetery behind the Methodist church, but it was very limited. So with that, trying to figure out all of the complications with very few records, a lot of the records destroyed, I solicited Randall's help because when it comes to history, he's like a search and rescue dog. I mean, he can track down any piece of information. And so we then began, and all of a sudden it was like, this story of these incredible people who went through so much adversity in the early years of Santa Cruz, but just kept giving to community, really building Santa Cruz no matter what came about. And so that was the decision then to turn it into a book. Oh. So it's really the story of the roots of Santa Cruz, but the bigger theme is this commitment to community.
I see. I see. Yeah. And I'm amazed. I'm astounded at how many very significant souls reside there.
And who left a legacy here? I mean, just the example of Frank and Lillian Heath, helping to found the Art League 100 years ago, and
The home of the Last Supper.
Yes, and the Art League is thriving today. So,
And that's on Broadway, yeah, just right up from Ocean Street. I remember that. Yeah, in fact, yeah, even as a kid, I wasn't all that interested in art, but I knew that there was this building that was devoted to art. It was sort of cool. Yeah.
Absolutely.
Okay, tell us about some of the other cool personalities that you discovered when you became more interested in this and interested enough to write a book.
Okay, on the front cover is this stunning woman named Belle Dormer. She was a total trailblazer, way ahead of her time, and was an adventurer and was one of the first women mushers. Is that how you say it? A musher in Alaska? Is that what you are?
Wow.
And she was
Yeah.
also an accomplished deer hunter, helped start a newspaper in Alaska. Yes, and became a very celebrated journalist in the 1890s. So when President Harrison came to Santa Cruz in 1891, she got the primo story about President Harrison's visit. She also covered the suffrage movement, and just an extraordinary woman, a great poet, and when she spent the last 30 years of her life in Santa Cruz, wrote poetry for the Santa Cruz Sentinel. So that's an example of the kind of person who is in this book and really contributed to Santa Cruz.
When did she pass?
1936 or 7.
Okay, so
She had a very full life and quite a few husbands.
I'll be darned.
They couldn't keep up with her.
Wow, you can't really tell. Well, I guess, I can imagine just looking at this photograph on the cover of Evergreen Cemetery of Santa Cruz. Okay, Loudon Nelson, whose real name was London Nelson, right? Even I
Thank
know
you,
that. Is buried there
Yes.
as well.
I'm going to yeah.
Oh, okay.
Randy is great on this topic, and why don't you talk about London?
Well, what we found with him was that it was a compelling story from the gold rush that, he came out here. It is London because his master had a way of naming his slaves after places in London. And London, Marlborough, etc., Canterbury, So he did very well during the gold rush. London came out as the cook for himself and another one who was a blacksmith, and so they earned enough money to buy his freedom. The master went back to Tennessee, but then, the London Nelson story is one of entrepreneurship. That I kind of hate to say it because it's a cliche, but he made his money selling watermelon, which was a very successful crop back in the gold rush days.
Now, wait a second. The reason you hate to say it because it's a cliche is because he was black.
Yes, he was.
And people, it's sort of a slur almost to talk about watermelon and black people in the same sentence.
Yeah. But one of the interesting things was that he was able to do that because he had the support of a white guy from Alabama whose family was very large in the slave business. But James Pruitt, who owned a livery stable, actually provided London with the means. He let him have a wagon to take his food around town, and he also provided him with a plot of land, which eventually he sold to London, which is the famous piece of land that became part of the high school steps in the day. But actually, the most interesting
You're talking about Santa Cruz High School steps?
Yeah, it was actually the steps. It's still there. The steps are there. That was the piece of land that they bought with his estate.
That goes from the lower field to the upper baseball field? Because I went to Santa Cruz High School.
I'm sorry. This is the original high school, which is on Mission Street, just up from Pacific.
Oh, okay. Where
Yeah, and that
the
was
Board of Education was for many
Right,
years,
and that's-
isn't now, right?
right. But those stairs are where his property was, the property they bought from him.
Okay.
But the one other thing about him, which is a mystery still, and Phil Reeder, the great local historian who's passed a few years ago, had an article which is that London was probably not the only person buried in his plot. There were apparently 4 other black people who, since they already had a plot set aside, were buried in the same plot. And Phil wrote an article about that, which I recommend. It's on.
What do you mean a plot? I mean, like not in the same
Well,
grave.
you would
in the same.
in the same plot. You know, there was a plot could hold more than one grave, and most of them do.
Oh, okay.
Right. It was a family-oriented place,
Right.
and so London didn't really have any family, so there was still room in the plot.
Oh.
But yeah, so there's.
But there wasn't, to this day, there is strangely not much of a black population.
No, there were really
in Santa Cruz, and was he the only one back then?
No, there were half a dozen connected with the Pacific Ocean House, barbers and other boot blacks. There were only a certain number of jobs opportunities open. And then we also found George Chester, who was an entrepreneurial type, who ran different restaurants.
Also black?
Also black. So, you know.
There might have been more black people then than now.
Well, roughly about a dozen, maybe 20. I don't know. I don't know how we're doing now.
Well, I don't see many, and haven't, as I was. In fact, yeah, I'm just trying to think. I think there seems to be fewer. This is just me talking. Obviously, there seems to be fewer black people around these parts now than when I was growing up in high school. We had you know. Yeah, we did. We had our share. But anyhow, so yeah, London. How did London get turned into Loudon?
If you look at some of the old records, it's handwriting. As much as anything, you could read it as an N or you could read it as a U. You know, and so that is a judgment call, but I think the judgment is in favor of London.
Okay.
I don't know if we can get him to change the center's name, though.
Yeah, that would be, yeah. And the Loudon Nelson Community Center, which was established, I think, in the mid to late 70s, am I correct? At the old Laurel School site. That's where I went to kindergarten.
Wow.
Yeah.
Very cool.
Did you too?
I didn't. I'm completely a Scotts Valley elementary school person.
Oh, okay. Yeah, because when they turned that into a community center, I said, that's pretty cool. I'm going to go back to the kindergarten classroom with those funny windows that opened with you, one window automatically connected to the other 2 windows above it. And I remember crying hysterically when I was left at kindergarten and my mother left. And I was left with all these other people, all these other kids who had to take... No, that was nursery school when I cried and screamed because I had to take my shoes off and I had to take a nap on the floor on a blanket. But there was other reasons for me to cry for kindergarten. I forgot what they were. Anyhow, you can tell some radio people have just incredible egos. They have guests to talk about a nice subject, and then they commandeer the whole program to talk about themselves as if anybody gives a damn, right? So I apologize for doing that to you just now. So
So let's tell you a couple of other really interesting
Please.
people.
Yes.
Okay, so the Heaths really promoted the art community in Santa Cruz, and they had left this enduring legacy. And I should say, one of the very cool things is that Lillian Heath gave a collection of Frank Heath's most spectacular landscapes, oils, to the Methodist Church. And the Methodist Church in Santa Cruz has been fabulous stewards of that collection. So you can go into the Methodist Church and it's like
on High Street?
No, on California.
And that's right, where Hillary visited.
Okay.
Hillary visited for the funeral.
Okay, I didn't know that.
Yeah.
And it's like a gallery for Frank Heath. And in their community room is this enormous mural that Frank Heath did of Point Lobos, and it's absolutely spectacular. So that enduring legacy has been maintained by the Methodist Church. And then Frank Heath's best friend in life was, he born same time. What year were they born, Randy? Do you remember? 1860?
1860 roughly.
Yes. Was a man by the name of Henry Thompson, and his stage name was Enrico Tommaso. And he really built the music culture in Santa Cruz. So you have Frank Heath building the art culture, in the Victorian era. And then you have Henry Thompson building the music culture. And Henry he was supposed to become a lawyer like his grandfather, Judge Rice. And we talk all about Judge Rice, who was my great-great-great-grandfather in the book. And he was supposed to become a lawyer, and he went to work in the Secretary of State's office, and he goes, I hate this. And he said, I'm going to pursue my singing career. And you'll like this, pursuing his singing career. Aren't you a singer, Michael? They tell me you're a singer. Are you going to burst into song?
No. Unless you, and I'm not putting you on the spot, or someone in the audience just can't live without me singing. But this is totally inappropriate today.
But Henry Thompson was an opera singer. Can you sing opera?
No.
Oh.
No.
Okay.
I have a friend who is trying to infect me with opera-itis. And so far
didn't work.
Well, I mean, I think it could. I was definitely making some headway when the pandemic hit.
Okay. So Henry Thompson, he goes off to Milan to pursue his opera career, and he does very well. He has several European performances, but he also has mishaps where a stage collapses, he breaks several bones.
Wow.
So he comes back to the United States, goes on these opera tours, but it's like the U.S. is not an opera culture in the way that Europe is. So from that point, I'm going to turn the rest of the story over to Randall about then how does Henry get back to Santa Cruz and really start promoting music and starting all these music venues in Santa Cruz.
Yeah. Well, I mean, obviously his opera training was very valuable for opera, but once he got back to New York, he realized that there weren't major opportunities. He did a couple of different operas, but what he wound up doing was what's called light opera, which is to say musicals. Essentially, it was kind of musical comedy. And he was a bass. He had a very deep voice, and so a lot of the roles were either villains or comic. He wasn't really getting star parts. He was basically getting supporting roles. But he was kind of good at entertaining people. So then what he finally got an offer to do was to be part of a minstrel show. So which again, politically incorrect as it was, that was what he had to do for a living.
Well, it wasn't back then.
No, it's true.
And politically correct as it has become, I think.
It's
right?
They were very popular in Santa Cruz, and in fact, there also were colored minstrel companies. George Chester's daughter was actually part of an all-black minstrel company, even though they may well have worn blackface. But so finally, Henry comes back to Santa Cruz with the minstrel show, and everybody gets to see him on stage in blackface with a white wig. And that was kind of the end of his, that was about at the end of his career. I think he finally realized that local attractions were good, and Traci can give you a little more on that.
So he comes back, and this is in the late 1880s, and lo and behold, he meets Lottie Dane, who's a local music teacher. And he decides, hey, I think I want to stay in Santa Cruz. So they start doing duets together, and they start performing together, and they bring in other musicians like Roland Case, and lo and behold, a year and a half later, they get married. But their marriage and the ceremony at the Episcopal Church, it's so jammed because they were so popular. Everybody wanted to see them. Ladies were fainting because everybody was trying to jam into the Episcopal Church. A hilarious story.
In the same place where it is now?
At the same place.
On Center Street and
yes,
Lincoln?
Exactly. Yeah. And the Episcopal Church.
No social distancing there.
Right.
Wow.
So he created men's choirs. He was a great music teacher. He did a lot of fundraisers for the Democratic Party, which his father had been very involved with. So he really became a Santa Cruzan promoting music. He unfortunately died of consumption at a very early age. He was about 45.
Whoa.
But the last years of his life, he lived on Beach Hill, in the Carmelita Cottages, and his neighbor was Frank Heath. So these two best friends from childhood got to spend the last years of Henry Thompson's life together. But that brings us to then the Episcopal Church. Episcopal Church, the church that has been here the longest, still standing. That story, Eliza Bull, she came from New York from a very sophisticated, cultured family, and married Joseph Boston. They were very committed to the Episcopal faith. So she, from her own money, gave the money to buy the land and create the church on Center Street. That was unheard of, that a woman in her own right did that back then. So she created the Episcopal Church, and they then brought those gorgeous stained glass windows that are still in the Episcopal Church.
Yeah.
Brought them from New York. She started the music program at Calvary Episcopal Church, and later hired Enrico Tommaso, Henry Thompson, to be the music director at Calvary Episcopal Church. I'm telling you that because, Michael, all of these lives are intertwined. Santa Cruz, as you know, growing up here, Santa Cruz was a small town, and Santa Cruz continued to be a small town up until the 60s, where everybody knew everybody else. You know that from growing up here.
Pretty true, yeah.
It was pretty true.
Yeah.
But back then, all these lives were intertwined. All these values from people from all these different parts of the world were converging to create the values that became Santa Cruz.
Actually, it's interesting about the two of them that they were sort of the after pioneer generation. Like, I don't think the pioneers would ever have considered a career in art or a career in opera. But here, this younger generation has a whole different type of aspiration, and it was more cultural than anything else, which is kind of neat.
And then you have this phenomenal woman, Grace Delamater, who became the head of the Santa Cruz High School drama department, and she had such high standards for drama, teaching classic drama, having students perform Shakespeare and all these classic plays. Now imagine this. Okay, it's 100 years ago, and it's fashionable now, but she actually would play male roles, and she was the prince in Cinderella. There are great pictures in the book of her being the prince in Cinderella, of being Shylock in The Merchant of Venice, and she got rave reviews, and she really promoted the performing arts in Santa Cruz, and ended up being a single mother, had to be self-supporting. But in the context of all that, during World War I, she went door to door throughout Santa Cruz. Everybody knew her, everybody knew Grace, and she was the biggest fundraiser for war bonds. And that's the kind of commitment to community that you see throughout this book, of these individuals that always made time to commit to community.
Actually, Grace probably sang at more funerals at Evergreen than anyone else. That was she was always in the choir when somebody was passed away, which is kind of interesting to me. You know that. Also, the other job she had for a time was after World War I. She was hired at the casino or the boardwalk as a chaperone, because people were like dancing in some modern ways that were not entirely appropriate.
Right.
So she would go and tap on their shoulder.
Koa Nut Grove. Huh?
Right. Yeah. She had to make sure it was all totally appropriate.
Actually, social distancing did apply there.
Great. Well, so back to the whole thing about why the Evergreen Cemetery was conceived and developed. You said there were, if you weren't Catholic, where did you get buried?
Exactly.
Now, okay, so I didn't realize that you had to be, apparently you had to be Catholic to be buried at the So where were people being buried before there was an
Well,
alternative?
I mean, partly, I think Evergreen's origin had to do with the family plot. In other words, if your family had land and had the unfortunate, death of one of your members, that was one of the options. That one of the things that made researching Evergreen challenging was that after it was established, people were moved there from elsewhere. For example, the Williams family had been buried out on the coast at Laguna, where they had a ranch. But it was part of his will that they be brought there. He goes, I want my children and wife with me. It
doesn't matter where.
Right. And the little Methodist cemetery, the same thing happened. They decided to build a bigger church. And so they told everybody to dig up the bones and move them to Evergreen or else.
So when did it become a requirement that you may not bury your own on your own land? Because I think that's a requirement now, right?
What a great question. I don't know
that's a
that.
good question. Yeah.
Maybe some of your listeners will know the answer to that question. I don't know that. But in 1858, when they created the cemetery, it was because a local who was very well known and had ridden in General Fremont's brigade, Henry Spiel, he fell off West Cliff Drive and died on the rocks below. And he had no family. He had no place to bury him. And so there was kind of this, oh my gosh, what are we going to do? And that was in 1858. And so everybody got together. The Imuses had already buried two of their own on their land. And it was when Henry Spiel died and there was no place to bury him, the community all came together. The Imuses said, we'll give the land. The Methodists were all on board with it. The Masons really said, absolutely, we'll support this. And of course, Evergreen is the concept of the Masons for cemeteries. And they use evergreens in all of their rituals for cemeteries. So the Imuses and others were very involved in the Masonic order here. And so they all came together and it happened like, Randy, what? It was just in a period of several days that all of the paperwork, everything
Well, they'd
came
been
together.
talking about it for months, but nothing had happened. So yeah, once they finally decided to do it, you see a couple, they got it through the county clerk pretty quickly.
Like 3
couple
days.
of weeks. Yeah.
Well, when you bring up the term Masons, in my mind, I think of the Masonic Temple on North Branciforte, on Branciforte, I guess it's South Branciforte, near Water Street, wherever, Branciforte Elementary School is. And I also think of Paradise Park.
Which is very
Was
legitimate.
Paradise Park in existence back then?
It was the powder mill. It was where they manufactured gunpowder. And so after World War I, that ended, and so then the Masons bought it in like the early 1920s. And you have to be a Mason to live there.
Right, even to this day.
Yeah.
And is it hard to become a Mason?
I wouldn't know. You have to ask one.
Are there any Masons out there listening? I'm very interested in the prospect of becoming a Mason and what's involved.
It was a very important connection back in the pioneer days, because it was actually probably the most non-denominational sect. They were all across at least the Protestant spectrum, and so in the early days they were one of the major social groups. They would hold dances and balls every year, and so quite a few of them really came from that background.
Because I know that the Masons were sponsoring the young girls group, Job's Daughters. And I also know that they were sponsoring the young boys and men's group called Demolay, right?
Right.
Okay.
And the Masons, in the 1850s in Santa Cruz, we wouldn't be a town for another decade. So the Masons took it upon themselves to have the major ceremonies. They did 4th of July. They they became the mechanism by which civic pride was developed in Santa Cruz. And of course, they have the Masonic plot at Evergreen. for Masons. There's there's the GAR plot for members of the Grand Army of the Republic. There's the Masonic plot. There's the whole Chinese section. So the Masons right away were big supporters of, we have to have a cemetery that is open to everyone.
Yeah.
Is there any space left at Evergreen?
Yeah, some if you have a plot. That's in other words, you have to be family.
So now we talk about that in the book of internments that have happened at Evergreen, but at this point it's putting ashes at Evergreen in a family plot that has been in the family for generations. And that happens 2 or 3 times a year. And this wonderful Evergreen committee takes care of all of the arrangements to make that happen. And so that happens 2 or 3 times a year now. And, but there's no way to buy land there now.
No, and in fact, the reason that there was a GAR plot and a Masonic plot was that there were only so many original plots that were purchased. I mean, you'd go in, this was like in the 1850s, they had a map on the wall, and you would say, okay, I want that one, or I want the one, up tall. Like some of the richer people actually chose the heights, where they could really get a good view, I guess. So they really kind of ran out of available plots. So the one thing that makes Evergreen unique is that it was also the public cemetery. As you could buy a family plot, but if you died, without money in the county hospital or whatever else, that was where you'd be buried. So that originally was why the Chinese were buried there. Although eventually they wound up buying their own plot.
And Randy, why don't you say something about the extension? It's really interesting. So many people, if you look at the plot, the designations, a lot of people from the 1960s and 70s who were indigent or didn't have families were buried in the extension, which is the farthest out section, and it was added. When was it added?
It was added in the 40s, and because actually they were hoping to raise some money by selling some plots. In other words, they were hurting. They were operating on a very, very tight budget during the Depression. And so they did decide, okay, we can buy this little piece of land next to it and extend the cemetery. And so I guess eventually the county started taking advantage of that as well. But yeah.
So you have every single class background, minorities of, you have such a, Linda Berman Hall likes to call it the microcosm of Santa Cruz. That's what Evergreen was. Of course, it did not include Catholics, but other than those that were buried at the Catholics.
Catholics were excluded, or wouldn't they even want to?
Mostly
because they had their own.
Mostly they wouldn't want to, but what we did find were cases of lapsed Catholics. People who, the one Native American renounced the Catholic faith. One of the Hispanic people who had really old roots in the community, Lorenzana, also went away from the church. So this would be the default. I guess you'd go here if you weren't going to be buried at the church.
So Randy, I'd love, because another musician, fabulous musician, would you tell the story of Lorenzo Masario?
Well, it's a bigger story than us in a way. Lorenzo was a survivor of the mission system. He grew up. His father had been brought to the mission, let's just say, and served there. And so Lorenzo was born at the mission, and later, and he was just a talented musician to begin with. And so he was singing in the choir and at the church, and
really played both the clarinet and the flute.
No, and the governor came to visit, and he was about to break up the missions. But the governor was so impressed that he actually brought Lorenzo with him to Monterey for further training, including on the clarinet. There was a soldier who was particularly skilled, and so Lorenzo learned clarinet. He learned violin. He sang. And he, even after the church was, the mission was broken up, he continued to sing at the church. One of the bishops actually praised having heard him. So for many years, the Native Americans were providing the music at the church.
And also for local festivities. I mean, there would be local
for dances.
events for dances, and he would be the leader of the music that would be provided.
And they were very versatile. They would go from playing classical music to the latest dance tune, whatever the audience wanted. But they knew Handel. They could, they knew their church music. So then ultimately Lorenzo wound up giving interviews. There were people who Bancroft sent out historians to interview people who had lived through the early period. And Lorenzo, who spoke Spanish, he actually didn't really speak English, gave a really good interview in the 1870s about growing up in the mission system. And then later on, he did it again with a guy named Edward Williams, who was also Spanish speaking. He had a Californian wife. And so Lorenzo left behind this legacy of these interviews, which are absolutely the best source today on Native American life, because he not only spoke about his experience, but he spoke about what his father had experienced. He talked about some of the language and some of the food ways. And so, very important character. And then he wound up at Evergreen.
Truthful and very truthful. I mean, he wasn't trying to paint this. I mean, there's a real contrast between how the Catholic priests were talking about that period and how Lorenzo talked about that period. Very different views on what that period was like for the Native people. And so to me, he's this example of incredible courage, because he did tell the truth. He was totally embedded in the community. And that's what I think is so important about these stories of how these people are so embedded in the community, and then these legacies that they live. And what for us was so astounding is that in 1891, when they have the centennial for the mission, he's one of the dignitaries that are brought in, but he dies like 2 years later, and
we don't know exactly.
There's no record. I mean, there's no record of his death. And so it's like, so he was important enough to bring in as a dignitary, but then there's no record.
Yeah, well, and again, he left the church, so not too long after that event. But yeah, and actually, see, one of the real good things about doing this project on Evergreen is that we were able to, because of their people, we were able to put a face on some of these movements which are more generally discussed. Like, people talk a lot about the mission period, but this is a guy who lived through it. This is someone who talked about his personal experience. So it's not just some random Native American or Ohlone. This is Lorenzo Cesare, who's now remembered. And it's true, certainly, we tried to do the same thing with the Chinese, to put a face on some of them.
Where is his resting place?
Potter's Field. We're not entirely sure where in Potter's Field.
And because it's not a marked grave?
No, and a lot of them aren't.
Because
that's
you
one
didn't
of the
even
issues.
Know the date of death.
One of the major issues in terms of doing the history is that in the early days, most of the headstones weren't stones; they were made out of redwood. So you had a certain amount of things that were just plain lost, and I think the Evergreen Committee has been doing a really good, diligent job of figuring out, occasionally with the help of cadaver dogs, where everybody is, and putting back headstones where they can. But quite a lot of information is just plain lost.
Wow.
I just wanted to say something, because you started the conversation an hour ago, Michael, about the issue of headstones, and when you used to, be hanging out at Evergreen or whatever.
We never did any kind of vandalism.
Oh, thank you.
No,
That's
never
good.
would we
Right,
do that.
of course.
But I was I was saddened.
Right.
By the fact that there seemed to be quite a bit of damage, and therefore quite a bit of disrespect.
So just to compare and contrast, so a decade ago, my fourth great grandparents, Hiram and Ruth Imus, their headstones, which are right at the beginning of Evergreen Cemetery, lying on the ground, broken, probably 45 other headstones were the same way. Today, you go to Evergreen, all those headstones have been repaired, beautifully restored. You don't see any headstones lying on the ground.
Good.
Just this extraordinary.
Yeah, that changed years ago. So it's being patrolled, and there's security now, and
right? excuse me, there's so much commitment this of saying we want to now keep this maintained. We want to continue the momentum. And it all comes down to the maintenance has to be the first part. You have to have a maintenance program because it's so beautiful there. It gets overgrown so easily. So if you don't keep the briars and the brambles and all the overgrowth done, it then becomes this sort of haunted, weird place again.
Right.
So that has to be the bottom line of keeping the physical maintenance down. Then you can do all the other things like restoring headstones, like putting in new markers, like creating beautiful signs now for each of the paths at Evergreen have been made. The Evergreen Committee has put in several retaining walls to make sure that floods don't affect or change the location of graves. So yes, the last 10 years has been the Evergreen Renaissance, absolutely.
No, and actually, just in case it isn't clear, the Evergreen was purchased by the Museum of Art and History back in the 90s. And so they are
I don't think it was
stewards.
purchased. It was like
Well,
given
it was given
it
to
was
them.
handed
They
to
took
them.
responsibility
Yes.
for it, let's just say.
Right.
I don't know if they paid for it, but so that really was a big change. At least
Well,
it
that's
has
an
a patron.
interesting thought. I mean, I like to check the tax rolls to see who owns what. It's a pastime of mine, and I like to invest in real estate and so forth. But so if I were to check the tax rolls, anybody could check the tax rolls. It's public information. If I were to do that now for that parcel of land on Evergreen Street near Harvey West, it would show as the owner, Museum of Art and History.
Yeah, I've done that. There's a transfer from the Historical Society, which was the custodian at one point, to it was actually to the transitional Ma team, but then it goes to Ma in the late 90s, mid to late 90s. So there is such a transfer.
That's great.
Yeah.
I mean, it's natural. I mean, so
It commits
somehow,
them to history, which is a good thing.
right, the art and history. Yeah, the Museum of Art and History.
Which we really hope that they will live up to.
There's the art part of it that just, I have to say this. So in the 1880s, we have this incredibly talented gravestone carver from Vermont arrive in Santa Cruz. And he starts the Santa Cruz Granite and Marble Company, and he makes these gorgeous headstones that are very artistic. And you see the difference, Michael, between headstones that were done before 1890 and then the headstones that John Henry Bilodeau started doing. But he didn't just do headstones for Evergreen. He did them for all over. He did headstones in the Jewish cemetery.
I was going to ask about that.
Exactly.
A home of peace up on Meter Street.
Exactly. And
That's a pretty old cemetery itself.
exactly.
Yeah,
And you know that
1870s.
George Fogelson is now finishing the book.
George has an amazing book.
Yes,
Yeah.
but he's finishing the book on that cemetery. So John Henry Bilodeau, he just completely raised the bar by doing these very artistic and beautiful, and this is an example. On the front of the book, Michael,
Yes.
that's one of John Henry Bilodeau's beautiful artistic headstones.
Oh, I was going to say, how do they keep the headstones repaired and maintained? Because there are just so many. It's got to be a lost art. I mean, there's so many different styles and so forth.
That's a fabulous question. So when the earthquake happened, the Loma Prieta earthquake, FEMA allowed Santa Cruz to bring up one of the top restorers for Mexico City, Alejandro.
I want to find out all about that in the next hour, but we're at the end of this hour on the Saturday Special on your favorite radio station, AM 1080 KSCO Santa Cruz.
Valley and Highway 1 southbound near Highway 129 due to an earlier collision. Outside the KSCO studio, it's 58. We're expecting the upper 60s today and cloudy skies. Overnight temperatures mid-50s, patchy fog expected. We'll be clearing out by Sunday. Time now for the Saturday Special, 11:06 at KSCO.
Josh Stevens.
MZ, Michael Zwerling.
It sounds decidedly as if the weather, she's a changin'.
That it is. We could be getting to winter almost, because we had a little bit of a mist this morning.
Yeah, well, it's supposed to warm up later this week, though, right? I think it's going to be in the late.
By next week, we will
By
be
next
warming
week,
up.
okay. So yeah, I always remember 1989. You know, the earthquake, October 17th. That was one of the hottest days of the year, as I recall. It was sweltering.
Well, what I
That's
know,
why when they say it's earthquake weather, when it's super hot and sort of sticky, muggy.
yeah, that's what I notice. We always get one last blast of summer during the months of October and November. Like, we'll just get some triple
November
digit.
too?
Yeah, we'll have a triple digit day every now and then.
Wow.
It just happens. It's like an Indian summer or something.
Well, do you think the Indian people would take offense at that term, Indian summer?
I don't believe so, but we might have an expert on the matter. So
Who, where, when?
I don't know. One of your guests nodded their head to that, so they might have a statement on that matter.
Okay,
I think
yeah.
they probably would, times being what they are. Yeah.
Yeah.
That's fair.
Because they're
Yeah,
not
that's-
really from the Indies.
Randall Brown. Yeah, I know, because people thought the Indians are Native Americans here, but Christopher Columbus, as I recall from grammar school days, Christopher Columbus thought he had found a route to India, and he was only not even halfway there. He was like a third of the way there. And so he called them Indians, and they weren't Indians. They were Native Americans, damn it. So-
Indigenous people, yes.
Yeah.
And actually, it seems like people want to be very specific, especially in California, because it wasn't a nation, it was groups of people.
Right.
So their identification probably wouldn't be with the larger group, it would be with the family clan group.
Right.
So Ohlone or one of those is a closer term.
Yeah. I really enjoy taking a break from politics and typical talk radio fare. So I got to say, I'm having a great time, with you guys here. Traci Bliss, who is the author of Evergreen Cemetery of Santa Cruz, and who has a great website called tracibliss.com, TRACYBLISS.
TRACI.
Oh, I'm sorry. Thank you for correcting that, because now I'm going to correct it so that I don't say it wrong again. It's like can you imagine a host having a guest that they can't even pronounce their name or spell their name? This is an outrage. But anyhow, so we have Traci, and we also have Randall Brown, who is a local historian. And I was just saying, it's during the break, Randall and I were talking. I was saying it's got to be fun. You must have a really fun life, being an historian.
Well, I like solving puzzles, for one thing, and I like stories. So it's rich in both of those. There's always something you don't know and have to search out, and then it makes for a better story in the long run.
And we're always learning new things. People are always coming up with new information. I mean, one of the most exciting stories about Evergreen happened last year when we were able to figure out that Matthias Lorenzana, from one of the families who's been in Santa Cruz County the longest, for 200 years, was actually buried at Evergreen, and get a marker for him. And so but that's because there are so many people doing new research, new things are coming to the surface. So it's never that the story is completed, which is always the risk when you write a book, because it can be outdated a month later, because new information is coming out all the time, especially with newspapers.com.
When you made that statement a minute ago about grave marker, that was discovered that so-and-so was, now has a grave marker. How many graves at Evergreen have grave markers as opposed to headstones?
Most of them are headstones
That's what I would have thought.
that have survived.
Oh, right,
Again,
of course.
you know, most of the headstones in the Chinese area, for instance, were redwood. And there's a replica of one of them.
Yeah.
So now in the Chinese section, there are 5 grave markers. So the markers are what the Evergreen Committee uses to replace where there were headstones or tombstones. But as I was saying before the break, after the Loma Prieta earthquake, a top expert, Alejandro from Mexico City, came to Santa Cruz for several months, maybe even a year, and there were at least 38 headstones that were so badly damaged or completely turned around that he worked constantly at Evergreen, and a lot of people could go out and watch him. So it really raised the bar in terms of local interest in headstone restoration and how the process worked.
I see. Yeah, so guess what, gang? We are entering hour number 2, but you'd never know it because we haven't played the official entry that people, music that people are used to hearing. So we're going to do that right now. And then we're going to invite callers for the rest of the hour. I don't know if we're getting any callers because people are transfixed in the discussion.
We want
here.
the callers.
We do want the callers. So
the callers.
479-1080, area 831, or you can even email mz@ksco.com. If you have a question or a comment for Traci Bliss or for Randall Brown, and we'd love to hear from you. But for right now, let's hear this.
Oh, hello, darling. I hate to hang up on you, but I'm sorry, baby, but I have to go. It's time for that wonderful record show. I'd love to visit, but you'll have to call back. KSCO has the inside track.
831-479-1080, phone number to call if you want to join the show today. We're talking about historical people in Santa Cruz who are buried at Evergreen.
I'm sorry, baby, but I really gotta go to KSCO Radio. Bye.
And our guests are Traci Bliss and Randall Brown. Randall's a local historian. Traci is the author of Evergreen Cemetery of Santa Cruz. And so who was the last person buried at Evergreen? And was it a famous person or someone who deserves mention as not your run-of-the-mill everyday person?
I don't know when you say last person, I don't know who that would be, actually.
There's a recent one, though. I mean, the Shoepacks.
The Shoepacks, that they had an internment, a family internment there. But I'm thinking back to, I just have to think about that, Michael, of who would have been the last major burial there. It really waned. I mean, burials at Evergreen. There was only one person from World War I that was buried at Evergreen, none from World War II. By this time, you see,
Really? Wow.
because all these other cemeteries had begun to proliferate in Santa Cruz County. So you had so many options for people. And there was the Watsonville Cemetery, there was the IOF Cemetery, Oddfellows. And because Evergreen could not offer the array of services that other cemeteries could, like IOF, that had constant maintenance and all these other, consistent records. So really, the last burials really went way down in number in the 1930s.
Is IOOF, is that the same as Santa Cruz Memorial Park?
Yeah.
Exactly.
Okay, because they have a mausoleum there, right?
Yes.
And yes, I have a very good friend who is in the mausoleum. Yep. Anyhow, we have some callers.
Yay.
479-1080 or mz@ksco.com if you want to join the program here. So let's go to Tom and Salinas, our first caller. Hey, Tom. Welcome to the Saturday special.
Yeah, I love hearing it.
With Traci and Randall and poor old MZ.
I love hearing this old history. I'm wondering if you're familiar with a guy named Don Howard down here in Monterey, who did a lot.
John Howard? Did you say John?
Don.
Your phone is really, really muffled, Tom. I don't know if there's anything we can do about it. We can barely understand you. You sound like you're in a mud bath or something.
How about now?
Well, a little louder for sure, but it's still muffled. Anyhow, why don't you spell it for us? It says here on the screen, Tom and Salinas suggests John Howard, but that's not what you're saying, right?
D as in dog, O-N, Howard. He's a pot hunter.
No, nobody nobody. The heads are shaking here. No.
I don't know anybody by Howard.
There's a funny sound. Well, we lost the caller here, but let's go to our good friend Tony in Live Oak.
Hi, MZ.
See, now that's a clear call. He sounds like he's right in the room.
Well, I'm only a couple blocks away, as you know.
Oh, no wonder you sound like you're right in the room with us.
Okay, well, I was operations manager of city schools when the Loudon Nelson Center was being named. It had not been officially named yet, and I think it was about the time that Proposition 13 came in, 77, 78. And so it was very easy to go out to the records and get the city plat map, the drawing of the actual map of the city, and all the property transfers in cursive writing. I think the letters were 3/4 to 1 inch tall, and I came up with the discovery that I was reading London Nielsen by analyzing all the rest of the handwriting around that. And it showed so if you look, anyone can go, in 5 minutes you can get to look at what I'm talking about. And there's a Nielsen, there's a Neilsen, very clearly, and so everyone seems to have missed that. But I told Lincoln Liu, who was the financial manager of city schools at the time, who made me the one-man committee to find out some background information, which was also very easy to get. And I wrote the report in about 1 day. And I had the my London Nielsen owning a farm next to the river,
That's right.
Close to where the present post office.
That's correct.
That's exactly right. Yes.
Okay.
So,
and
that's why he was so successful with his watermelons, because he was right there, right at the river, and he had, this fabulous agricultural land.
Well, I'm having a problem with watermelons because his last crop sold for $281, and they were onions.
Well, he
You know,
had
that money
onions
that-
too. Yeah.
He had onions too, but his major crop that he would sell to Santa Cruzans was watermelons.
Well, you can talk all you want, but I know what I read. It just said he did not sell anything but onions. Maybe all the watermelons rotted. I don't care. But it was $281 for the onions that were sold after he died. He was like a storyteller for the local children. Children loved him, so he loved the children. He wanted to do something for their education, so he donated, in his will, whatever it was, he said, I want the money to go to the school district. And then I guess Heen or somebody came in and traded his property for something up near the what you're talking about with a school district. And
that was in the 1870s. They held it for about 20 years, and then.
Well, but I didn't go into very much depth because there seems to be plenty of information around. Apparently, some of it about the watermelons was missing, and it was only the money from the onion crop that got donated. And so I reported to Lincoln Liu, the financial director, that the way I read the name, it says London Nielsen, and he just disagreed. That was disregarded completely in the report. Although my official report is somewhere in the records.
I know what you're
So
talking about too, though. I've did the same thing, and it's like, is that a U or is that an I? You know.
Well, all of the names look like you. You know. Or the
Okay.
U's look like
Tony,
N's, or
every
whatever.
time you call in, I learn something new about you. Amazing. Absolutely. Anyhow,
Thank you very much.
thanks for calling 479-1080. Here's Nancy in Aptos. Where do I get the book?
Yes, and what is the author's last name?
The author's last name is Bliss, like Bliss, like BLISS.
Right.
Okay.
So, Bookshop Santa Cruz, we really encourage people to buy local, so you can get it from Bookshop Santa Cruz. If you go onto my website, tracibliss.com, there are other options where it can be easily sent to you for free. So either Bookshop Santa Cruz or go on my website. I don't sell the books, but I have plenty of information on the website.
And
Okay,
it's
and the book title?
it's TRACI, not
Oh,
TRACY.
good. Thank you for that.
Yeah.
Okay. And the book title is Evergreen Cemetery of Santa Cruz?
Correct.
Okay, because you didn't repeat that enough, and it was tough
I'm
to get
sorry.
It, something
You'd
else.
think
Thank
that
you.
after all these years of being a talk host that I would say the obvious and do the obvious. But I just...
Yes, thank you.
All right. Thank you for calling
Bye-bye.
479-1080. Any other historians out there? This is a perfect program for historians to call in. But we do have our own historian, on site right now in Randall Brown. Okay. We go from like just one cemetery in Santa Cruz, the Holy Cross Cemetery, to the Evergreen Cemetery, and then a whole bunch of other cemeteries sprung up.
Yeah,
before the war.
IOF was 1870, and then the other ones were after the 20th century. Oak Lawn, I'd say,
Oh,
and others.
okay. And how do you make a cemetery? I mean, how do you
That's a
decide?
good question. You bury somebody there, I guess, and
Just bury somebody and say, here, this is a use that I've already established.
I think in this case, that was part of it, and then there was a real civic need. In other words, they really were having a problem figuring out where to bury people, and culturally, it was very important to have a place where you could visit your loved ones. That was part of it too. That it's a memorial park, just like the other one is, and so that was a function that people really valued.
Right. I just got sort of a fun email, and it's directed to you because you're an historian.
Okay, fair enough.
Okay. And it'll blow me away if you can answer this, because I've been posing this question for years and years. JC says, hey, Michael, perhaps Randall Brown could provide some insight as to the identity of my girlfriend, whose beautiful, sultry singing voice I hear only once a week around 11:10 a.m. on Saturdays on KSCO radio. Bye.
I wondered the same thing, but I'm afraid I have no more information.
I've been
I like the
asking that.
style. It sounded very 40s,
Well, when I was growing up, I wouldn't listen to the station because they had, old fogey music. They didn't have rock and roll like us kids wanted to listen to. But I would listen to KSCO because it was the only Santa Cruz radio station.
so that-
my parents would have it on sometimes.
and that goes back, that jingle.
Oh my God! That not only does that jingle go back, but I thought as a kid, as an 8 or a 9-year-old, that I figured that jingle did not fit the radio station. That's a sexy babe singing, and this wasn't a sexy babe radio station. It just wasn't. It was an old fart radio station back then because it had, It just had Montavani music.
No, we might be
I'm
able,
not bad-mouthing Montavani. It just wasn't for young people.
we might be able to search that one out. I mean, one thing that's happened.
Randall, if you could do that, and especially if the woman is still alive.
Yeah, I'll let you. Actually, the one advantage we really have now is what Traci mentioned briefly, newspapers.com. Almost all of the old Santa Cruz newspapers are now online. So that's the kind of question that if we go back to the origins of KSCO, we might be able to find a reference to it.
Our resident KSCO historian, who moved to heaven in 2013, Don Husing, might have been able to research that, because I asked him that question and he didn't know immediately offhand. Just so you're, I'll play just so you understand what we're talking about. I'll just put it out. There might be someone listening today. This voice.
Oh, hello, darling. I hate to hang up on you, but I'm sorry, baby, but I have to go. It's time for that wonderful record show. I'd love to visit, but you'll have to call back. KSCO has the inside track.
Oh, I'm in love with that voice.
I'll put it on my list.
Will you? Okay. Really? I mean,
Yeah, no,
it'd be so wonderful. Here, there's the
I
list.
love a mystery.
I'm sorry, baby, but I really gotta go to KSCO Radio.
Here comes the bye.
Bye.
Oh, totally sexy. Totally. Just,
They don't make them like that.
it didn't belong on KSCO. All Josh Stevens, you're screening a phone call, but can you pull up some of the other jingles?
Sure.
Yeah, because we need to. I love those jingles. We don't play them enough. All right, so we have. Oh my God! Can it be? Can it be? That here I have to get on. Da, 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 da. Casey T. Fertiller.
Hi.
Hi, Casey T. Fertiller. So John Henry Bilodeau, the famous headstone creator. Am I to understand that he is your great-grandfather? Am I to understand that?
That is correct.
Wow. That is so cool. That is so cool. Now, you didn't know him because most people don't know their great-grandfathers, right?
He passed away in 1919, so that was a little before I came along.
Wow, I didn't realize it was that far back. But
Since
anyhow,
I'm considerably younger than you are, so.
yeah, gee. So this is Casey T. Fertiller in person, calling our show, and Casey. So I can't wait to hear your question or comment because you are an historian yourself.
A historian is proper grammar.
Oh, sorry. Okay, yeah. Are you sure? I think I want to go on the mat with you on that. You know,
I'm ready.
An historian, I think, is the correct way. Isn't that correct, Graham? Casey says it's a historian.
It might have been in the 19th century, but
Okay.
A historian is correct grammar. Just Google it.
Okay. So, lucky we didn't. Yeah, I won't make a bet with you then.
But I want to know what the authors found that surprised them most. If there was ever a moment when their eyes got big and they were researching and they said, holy cow, this is a shock. Because I'll tell you, when I read that book, it happened to me about 3 or 4 times when I saw stuff in there that really surprised me. Was there ever a time when Randall or Traci found anything that just surprised them? And my other question is, would one of them talk a little bit about Arthur A. Taylor, who may be the most interesting person, second most interesting person who ever lived in Santa Cruz?
who's the first?
Doc Wing.
Okay.
Okay. So I want to take the opportunity to what surprised me the most and what I found so interesting is with the Chinese section in the cemetery, and at least 80 Chinese were buried there originally in the Chinese section. The piece of research that was like, this is so amazing. To learn that Juan Key, who was a major businessman in Santa Cruz and was sort of the unofficial mayor of Chinatown and the head of the Chinese Freemasons, that in 1901, he spent months negotiating with the city and raising thousands and thousands of dollars to buy the Chinese section. And it was like, well, why now? What was so significant about 1901 that would motivate Juan Key to spend so much time and energy and money to secure the Chinese section of the cemetery? And as it turned out, 1902 was the year that on a national level, they extended the Chinese Exclusion Act. So in other words, my understanding then was, oh my goodness, Juan Key did this as a very proactive move to make sure that with the increasing anti-Chinese sentiment, that there weren't going to be even more restrictions on the Chinese that could possibly interfere with their burial ground there. And so I thought that was just such a wonderful moment. And it showed to me this whole theme of how much the Chinese Evergreen was their symbol of commitment, and they were not going to let anyone mess with them.
That's a great story. You've got a great show going, Zwerling.
Okay, thank you. Let's make it a regular thing.
Okay.
We always say this every time we do a Saturday special that talks about history. You say, well, I got to do a regular show, and then another 5 years.
We're all for the history. I mean,
we need it. We really need it. We really need there's so much interest.
You guys want to do it?
Sure.
Wow. All right. We'll make it happen. We'll make it happen then. So.
We can get plenty of people who would love
I'm sure you can. And
yes.
maybe I don't want to volunteer Casey here, but I'll bet that's something he might.
No, that people underestimate the coolness of Santa Cruz history. It's actually like, we don't have any major battles. We don't have, anything like dramatic like that, but we have a really great culture. And one of my favorite things, which isn't evergreen, is the old movies. We were the site of a lot of great stuff. Actually, to go back to the question, finding that Lorenzo Asusaro was at Evergreen was a breakthrough. Because, he was so valuable in terms of understanding the period beforehand that it was like, oh, great, we can now, because we sort of had a rule that if you're not buried there, you're not in the book, So it was great figuring that one out. But in terms of somebody who's not buried there, I was fascinated by Traci's family's connection with the famous Chief Truckee, who the Truckee River was named after.
The river that flows upstream, that flows uphill,
yes,
right?
Because he helped. I mean, they had a major problem getting wagons over those mountains, and so Chief Truckee was really responsible for showing the pioneers the way. And then he wound up being a very close friend of the Imus family, and so his granddaughter, Sarah Winnemucca, actually spent some time living with the Imus family, and I just found that to be a very interesting and non-typical story of that period.
I never got to meet Don Imus before he moved to heaven, but what a character he was.
I used to listen to him all the time in New York.
Yeah.
He was great. He used to mess with commercials.
Wow. Hey, in case you're wondering who our guests are today, are Traci Bliss and Randall Brown. Traci has written a great book.
With Randall. Yes.
Oh, yes, of course.
I'm the with.
Yes.
I've said that 3 or 4 times. Thank you for bringing that up and correcting that, because it does say that very clearly. The billing is pretty much the same as yours.
I'm second banana.
Well, I mean, Traci Bliss's name is in all caps, is in all uppercase, and yours is in lower. Well, the R and the B, your initials, are uppercase, but all the rest is lowercase. So, but I think you're a great team, and if we're really talking about doing a show on Santa Cruz history, Monterey Bay Area history, and I'm talking to people who would like to do it, hey, we'll contribute the time and we'll make it happen. It'd be great, because that's the one thing that I've always wanted KSCO to have, and we never did. We just talk about it every time we have a show. Anyhow, Casey, thank you for calling. Are you done? Are you done? We want to leave you on as long as you want to be on.
Well, just one more question. If Randall or Traci would tell a little bit about Arthur A. Taylor, because he is just such a fascinating character, and it's just one of the most interesting people ever.
Yeah, let me start out by just saying this one thing about A.A. Taylor that I love, and that was that he so challenged the status quo. I mean, he was the Democrat-run newspaper, okay? He was an avid Democrat. He was very close to my family members, and the Sentinel was very much Republican. So there was this nice sort of holding each other accountable conflict. But the thing about A.A. Taylor that I loved the most was that he covered the cultural events in Santa Cruz. The Santa Cruz Surf, the reason why we know so much about the various people who were in the arts community and the music community and the performing arts is because the Santa Cruz Surf went into detail about cultural events. And that piece we would have never discovered. I mean, there's no way you could find that unless you're looking at all these different individuals. So that's something that he really contributed with his New York background, a real commitment to the arts in Santa Cruz.
Yeah. Actually, one fact I learned about him that I didn't really realize was that he grew up he had relatives in Elmira, New York. And so in the course of that, he met Mark Twain.
Wow,
who was one of
the Samuel Clemens, Mark
the Samuel
Twain.
Clemens, who was courting at the time, and so Taylor was like a dinner guest, absorbing, Mark Twain, which I find fascinating. But he also, I mean, this is kind of a spoiler alert, but A.A. Taylor's major contribution, apart from the surf, was his work on Big Basin. He doesn't get enough credit for that, that he was a big advocate. And not even more than Duncan McPherson, who one of the most fun of being a local historian is comparing the two accounts of Duncan and Taylor because they hated each other. And so any excuse to disrespect the other they would take, and they were both, pretty good writers, especially Taylor.
We have a full board. That is great. Thank you, Casey. And yeah, I'm sure we'll be talking about doing this regular thing that we're talking about, okay?
Great. Thank you.
All right. Thanks very much. That's Casey Tiefer-Tiller himself. That opens up a line at 479-1080. But here's Gordy in Deer Creek. Hi, Gordy in Deer Creek. You have some vital statistics for us.
Questions about vital statistics. Randall, in your whistling past to the graveyard, have you noticed anything about the age of people deceased, the cause of death and disease, anything that stands out?
Yeah, in the early period, there's a big difference between the men and the women. That the early period pioneers tended to die in their 50s or so, and the wives, a lot of them lived, very long lives. There's more than one who died in their 90s. So that was pretty striking. That a lot of the widow culture, and they all went on. A lot of them went on to pretty active, interesting lives. But yeah, that was noticeable. And then in the early period, there were a lot of infant deaths.
It was one of the hardest things of writing the book was how many families lost their children to childhood diseases, or later on to typhoid and other things. You just saw these families that, their children were preceded them, and yet then they would go on to be committed to Evergreen Cemetery. So, but this idea of the women, I was fascinated by what long lives many of the women had. Most of them that did were women of very profound faith. They were Episcopalians or Methodists or a lot of Congregationalists, and they were they just carried on and really gave a lot to Santa Cruz in the process.
The strong will had a lot to play in that.
Yeah, that's probably right.
Yeah. Getting back to the diseases, well, of course, we had the what do you call it? The Spanish flu, which came later, I guess, as far as the burials there goes. But in the earlier days, was there anything other than typhoid or these other things that stuck out? Were there periods of time where there were a lot of people that died for a particular disease or epidemic?
No, well, the most striking one there is before Evergreen, which is apparently the Native Americans took major hit from smallpox.
Right.
An awful lot of them died of the European diseases early on. I don't think it's quite as true of the Evergreen period, though, except for the childhood diseases.
And one of the things is that you're looking a lot of the children who died at, say, age 2 or 3 or 4. It doesn't give the exact cause of death. That was one thing that really stood out, that it didn't say what the cause of death was.
One thing about the men was also that they had early period, they had a lot of access to some really bad booze, and tended to absorb quite a bit of it. So some
You mean like rot gut?
Yeah, so guys like Isaac Graham, he probably accelerated his fate.
Wow.
Yeah, wood alcohol.
Close to it. Well, his was a little better. I mean, he was from Tennessee. But
Gordy,
All right,
thanks for
thank
your
you very
call.
much.
Appreciate it very much. Our next caller is Lane in Aptos, who has an Evergreen experience. Hey, Lane.
Yes, hi. Here, let me turn my car off. I pulled over because it just brought back so many nice memories. Many years ago when we used to have Loudon Nelson days,
Yeah.
I volunteered at the little Santa Cruz City Museum, and so I was given a lot of literature about the history of Santa Cruz to share with, of course, the school children. And, unlike maybe the more in-depth discussions you've had, I read and shared little anecdotes with the children about Evergreen. And, just to segue very quick, I think it's a wonderful idea to have a show that does discuss our beautiful, in-depth, and colorful history. And also, it's too bad that the schools don't incorporate that. But having said that, I was listening to someone speak. I'm sorry, the not the host, but who you've invited to bring on today. He was speaking about the Chinese area. And one story I know for sure is that a lot of families in China wanted their houseboys, because it was mainly men that were brought out there to work, that were living in Santa Cruz, not the women, and or not as many women. And when the families wanted those bodies dug up at cemetery to be in the cemetery to be brought back home, I read where they had like 3 ships out in the ocean waiting for these coffins, these bodies to be brought back up, and the boxes would be built the size of the femur bone, which is the longest bone in the body. And so they were all the same size boxes, and they'd collect all the bones from each of these burials, and they would put them on the ship and send them back to China. And I guess it was a family that loved their houseboy so much that they covered his crypt, or they covered his burial area in concrete so that he couldn't be moved. But, there was a very deep relationship that was built, between the Chinese and the people that settled in Santa Cruz.
We go into a lot of depth in that in the book, and we have one story about the Chinese man who was very much a member of one of the original families, and it's a wonderful story of Santa Cruz. One of the things in researching about the Chinese, there was a lot of anti-Chinese racism in Santa Cruz, and I don't even like to repeat the words that were used because they were so vitriolic, but what where the Chinese Must Go movement succeeded in other areas of Northern California, in other cities, and they actually drove out the Chinese, it didn't succeed in Santa Cruz. And we go into detail in that in the book. And that's because the Congregational Church had a Chinese mission, and they taught the Chinese English. And then there were 3 families that actually rented their land to the Chinese so they could have their successful market gardens, and that these Chinese could really flourish. And it was 2 of the widow women, Eliza Boston and Harriet Blackburn, that in the face of all this Chinese must go, they stood up and said, no, we are going to support the Chinese by renting our land to them. So those are detailed stories. But I want to come back to what you said about school children. And I think it's really significant that Santa Cruz Rotary has given a grant to the Museum of Art and History so that all 4th grade teachers get one of these books for free. So for their field trips, every 4th grade teacher has one of these books. So the kind of stories that you were able to share, that teachers now have a whole wealth of stories, and they can elaborate, and they can integrate them with their curriculum. So a big thank you to Santa Cruz Rotary and to the Museum of Art and History. On the Museum of Art and History, they have a lot of activities that they're doing surrounding Evergreen. Like they usually have a Day of the Dead ceremony every November. This year it has to be virtual, but the picture of that is on the back of the book.
Oh, lovely. I get a copy of that book. There was one more story I wanted to mention that maybe you could elaborate on a little bit.
Well, wait a second, Lane, I hate to do this, but we have a bunch of people lined up that we want to get to, and we're getting pretty close to the end of the show. So thank you for calling in with your great question and your great experience. But yeah, we'll be able to do this when we have the real show, when we have the regular show. Okay. Thank you, Lane. Here's Gary in Capitol. Then we have Craig in Campbell and Jan in Solv. But here's Gary.
Hi, I'm there now?
You're there now.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, I kind of caught the show, I assume, late, and I heard about Evergreen, and that always gets my interest out there. I go to Death Valley all the time, and I had read Death Valley in '49 by Lewis Manley, or William Manley.
Okay.
Yeah.
And, yeah, he references the Bennett Arcane party that came over with him in '49, and I was wondering if you were aware that the Arcane patriarch was buried there in Evergreen.
Absolutely. It's a great story, and we do go into detail about that and about their survival from Death Valley. And the interesting thing is the Arcane's son, Charlie Arcane, became, wasn't it, Randy? Was he the first lifeguard?
He was a major, when they first established the beach as a recreational activity, he was one of the lifeguards. Yeah.
And he
decorated for heroism.
And he saved Leland Stanford's life. And he also taught swimming lessons. And so the Arcane family has their entire plot at Evergreen, and it's a wonderful story, and thank you so much for bringing that up.
And he was amazing.
I'm glad to hear the book.
Okay, thank you, Gary, for calling 479-1080. Here is Craig and Campbell. Hey, Craig.
Yeah, hi. The call screener said he thought this was a creative question. What era would you guys want to live in Santa Cruz, looking back at the history? And MZ can jump in there, too. Michael, I want to ask you real fast. Back in the early 70s, when Santa Cruz was deemed the murder capital of the world, did you know any of those guys, Frazier, Kemper, and Mullen, by any chance?
No, not at all. But I was starting my media career. I was working at teleprompter cable TV, and I was the anchor. I was the 21-year-old anchor of the nightly half-hour news feature program called Cable 7 Feature News. And it was during that time that it were very exciting, scary times when we reported on one mass murder after another, 73.
Yeah, serial killers.
Yeah, exactly. But I did know Ed Kemper's mother, whom he decapitated. I did know her. I didn't know her real well, but she used to sign my parking permits. Clara Nell Strandberg was her name, and she worked at College 5. And every time I got a guest parking permit, she signed it.
This brings up an interesting decision we made in this book. There have been a lot of ghost stories told about Evergreen, and a lot of ghoulish stories. One about a woman who was murdered there. One about a well-known lady of the night. We didn't put any of those stories in the book. We made the choice. So I don't want people who are going to buy this hoping to find ghost stories and ghoulish stories. They just aren't in the book, even though we're heading towards Halloween.
A sequel?
No, not by us.
Not
by us.
So maybe the Chinese, they might qualify as ghosts. I mean, given that the bodies are elsewhere.
Okay, Craig, so what's your question?
What era would you guys like?
Oh yeah, that's right. You did give that question.
I think the 1920s, just because it was kind of colorful, and maybe the pioneer period, but the 20s comes to mind.
For me, it was the early 20th century when women were really finding their own voice. The women started the Santa Cruz Shakespeare Club that still exists today. They started the Santa Cruz Women's Club. They were really feeling their oats. And of course, as you know, when we had the first suffrage vote in California in 1896, and it was defeated. Actually, Santa Cruz voted for it. And then it was 1911 when the state actually passed suffrage for women. So I think that was a very exciting time to be a woman and making your mark.
Michael, what about you?
I'm happy with the era I'm in. Thank you, Craig and Campbell.
Okay,
I wouldn't change it. I wouldn't change it. I've had a hell of a run, And maybe if I knew more about history than I do, I would want to to have lived in one of these eras. But I'm perfectly happy. A great question.
Yeah, Michael,
thank you.
You're probably in the book of who's who.
Jeez. I don't know. Thank you, Craig.
I'll hang up. Next caller.
Take
Thank
care.
You.
Here's Jan in San Lorenzo Valley. That's what I refer to as Sliv.
Hi, Michael, Traci, and Randall. I just wanted to speak to the fact that we almost lost our little town here in Boulder Creek.
Oh, yeah.
The CCU fires. And it made me realize how much I love this little town and the whole San Lorenzo Valley. And I just want to put a plug out to the local volunteer fire departments who stood the ground. They would not leave. They said they were going to protect this town even if it went over their heads. They saved the school, the churches, the town itself. And they only got paid $8 for the whole 30-something days they fought because they only are paid on an incident basis. And I want to remind people that we are collecting money to help reward them or pay them for their effort and for saving our area. You can make donations at Liberty Bank, or Rosie from KSCO is collecting. Yeah, she's collecting money. But I just want to put out there how delicate.
Thank you, Jan.
And actually,
for remembering that. Yeah.
At the risk of plugging, I've been writing. I find it an interesting topic. I just wrote about the 1904 fire, which had a very similar dynamic. They also barely saved Boulder Creek.
Yeah, and you have a great picture in the press banner, this week's press banner, of a family sitting next to a giant redwood.
Oh, I have to look at that. I haven't seen that yet.
and Time Life has a series out been out for a long time, and there's one of the sections, they go on different occupations. One's called the loggers.
Oh, yeah.
And it's incredible, the pictures in there. But I just want to put out there how much I love this little town and the whole San Lorenzo Valley, and I'm just so thankful that we weren't reduced to a bunch of ashes.
I share that one. I live there, too.
I can't think of anyone who wouldn't agree with you. Thank you, Jan. Here's James in Live Oak, Native American burial site. What's that all about?
Hey, Michael, another fantastic show. Thank you. And I applaud your idea of having an ongoing show, maybe once a month, about history stuff. And please make a big part of the theme, death and dying of all kinds, and how we treat with the dead. In the summer of 1988, the Pope was dropping into California specifically to begin the process of sainthood for Fray Junipero Serra, who established the missions in Santa Cruz. At that time, the native people who were here, of a contingent of them, did a pilgrimage of all of the mission sites to do ceremony where the native burial sites were on the grounds of the missions. In San Juan Bautista, there were separate graves for the natives that were converted to Christianity, and another grave not kept so well for the ones that were not. Unfortunately, here in Santa Cruz, on a cold, rainy day, a few of us were up there in a circle with the native people, and they related that while the Catholics had promised to keep the graves sacred, they had actually paved over them up on Mission Hill. And I'm hoping in the future, at some point, they will be persuaded to reconsecrate that ground for the native people. Thank you very much for a great show.
Yeah, thank you, James. So, yeah, that's...
Great point.
That's true.
Very good point.
Who can argue with any of that? Okay, well, I guess that concludes the program. We don't have any other callers. We have one person, but that's the guest for next hour, which is the Tom Quinn Show here on your favorite radio station. And I'll put in a plug for the, I believe, one and only candidates forum that we're going to be doing this Tuesday night. Both candidates for the, I think it's the first district here, it's the Live Oak Supervisorial District. Manu Koenig,
Yes.
the challenger to John Leopold, the incumbent supervisor. They've both been invited. We'll see who shows up. Hopefully they both will.
What time is that going to be?
6 to 8 p.m.
Terrific.
This coming Tuesday evening. And we're running a promo, but I wanted to do my own promo here since we have a couple minutes left. And we definitely want to re-promote the website, tracibliss.com. It's TRACIBLISS.com. And if you go there, did you say you can buy the book?
You can. I tell you where you can buy the book. I'm not a bookseller, but we're hoping people. Of course, you can get it on Amazon. We're hoping people will buy local, and I've given them some local options on the website, and also excerpts from the book and beautiful photos from the book. I want to plug, and I want to give a plug to University of California, Santa Cruz, and the Museum of Art and History for the fabulous photos that are in the book.
Yeah, and Randall Brown also. You guys are great on the radio. And you make a wonderful team, just like you did in the book, obviously. So, thanks for being with us here on KSCO. And what are we doing next week? Well, we hardly ever know until like a minute before, and sometimes we don't even know when we're doing the show, what we're doing. But anyhow, you never know what's going to happen here on the Saturday special on your favorite radio station.
Unfiltered and unscripted.
Yeah. Now, listen, Josh Stevens, I was serious about a program about intelligent quotient, about IQ, because I want to find out more about that. I really do. And I want to find out how it's measured and how do they know that people aren't cheating.
I'll ask my Hollywood friend.
Oh, that's right. Oh, yeah. That reminds me again. We have to have I have to have a talk about that.